Well, hello everybody and welcome to this Climate Now live here on Euronews YouTube channel. My name is Jeremy Wilkes. I present a monthly program on Euronews giving you the facts on what's happening to our planet from the Copernicus Climate Change Service. It's great to have you with us here. Please send us your questions to this panel. We're going to be talking about whether the coronavirus pandemic had any real impact on the path of climate change. And joining us, we have the world famous conservationist Jane Goodall, the founder of the Jane Goodall Institute, Carlo Buontempo, the director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service, Nathan Metenier, a climate activist and youth advisor to the UN Secretary General, and we have Oksana Tarasova, a CO2 emission specialist from the World Meteorological Organization. Thanks everybody for being here. I have some questions already that people have sent through, and I'm going to put the first one to Jane. We had a question from Axel FVF on Instagram, who's asking, should countries see the climate crisis as being as important as the COVID crisis that we went through in 2020 and that we're going through now? What do you think? Your microphone is cut at the moment.
Uncut it. Okay.
There we go.
Sorry.
That's all right.
So we shall get through this COVID-19 pandemic at some point, because we always do, and more vaccines are coming. And indeed, it's caused suffering, it's caused death, loss of loved ones, loss of jobs. It's a nightmare. But when we emerge from it, we're going to be right back there with a far more serious existential threat, and that's climate change. Climate change is threatening the future of all life on planet Earth, including our own. And so actually, even now, it's more important.
It's interesting that you say it's more important, because I heard this morning that sitting in his Oval Office, Joe Biden has said, COVID is the first thing we need to get into. Climate is the second thing we need to get into. It's obviously shot up the agenda as far as American politics is concerned. But do you feel that there was a change in 2020 in our understanding of our relationship with the planet that kind of will push things forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, the COVID-19 pandemic, basically we brought it on ourselves. It's been predicted by those studying zoonotic diseases jumping from animals to people. And it's our absolute disrespect of the natural world and animals that's created environments which make it relatively easy for a pathogen like a virus to jump over and create a new disease in humans like COVID-19. I was going to say it's very, very clear that we need to develop a new relationship with the natural world and with animals. And this is exactly the same reason that's causing climate change, the same disrespect and the feeling that we rule the earth and we can do whatever we like.
Do you think there was a proper change, though, that was one that maybe we haven't had in the past few decades, that something happened in 2020?
I personally don't think so. I think it's just created a mass more awareness.
Right. Yeah. I'm going to bring in the climate scientists now, and everybody says we need to listen to the climate scientists to understand what's happening. Perhaps Carlo can talk to us a little bit about what happened from the climate perspective in 2020, which was a record breaker. We saw 38 degrees inside the Arctic Circle in Siberia. Carlo, tell us a little bit about 2020 and where it sits in terms of our understanding of climate change and what kinds of records and things were broken.
Hi, Jeremy. Yes, 2020 was indeed a very special year. So we released at the beginning of this month a press release stating that 2020, according to our records, was the warmest year at par with 2016. Other data sets may have had a slightly different ranking, but the overall picture is quite solid. So it has been a very, very warm year. And this is normal. You see variation in climate all the time. But it's not an event in isolation. You have to look at it in a perspective. And the fact that the sixth warmest year have all occurred in the recent most 6 years is quite telling in that respect. And if you remember back in the spring when we did a special on the state of the climate report that we published then, at that time we said that 11 of the 12 warmest year were have all occurred since the year 2000. Well, we already need to update that record to state that 13th of the 12 warmest year have occurred since. So an extraordinary warm year. And I think we have, maybe we can bring in the graphic number 2 that shows that very significant warming over the year. So
yes, these are some of the graphics that we prepared in advance, so we wanted to show everybody watching, because it's so important to get really to get your eyes on the facts. So talk us through this one, Carlo.
Well, what you see in red, the bar in red, represent the estimate of the coming from ERA 5, which is the data set we produce ourselves at the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecast as part of the Copernicus Climate Change Program. And they show the anomaly of the global mean temperature with respect to the 1981-2010 period. And as you can see, I mean, I was born on the leftmost part of the graph, as you probably.
Me too, yeah.
And as you can see, since then, the years have become generally warmer. I mean, you see the variation. There are variation year by year, but especially if you gather and you put together all these bars decade by decade, there is a clear trend going forward. And the different color, the different point represent different estimate coming from different groups. So the Japanese, the Americans, the British, they've all made calculation based on different technique, on different observation, on different methods to put them together. And as you can see, if you look carefully, for each year, the sequence of dots is slightly different. Some are on top, some are below, but the general tendency is the same. This gives us confidence that is not a fluke or something coming out of a specific setup. Is really what is happening in the world out there. So that's in summary.
Oksana, I think that something kind of happened in 2020 where people felt that because there was a reduction in emissions, everything was kind of okay, which is something that you spend your time debunking. Tell us a bit about that, because there was this kind of famous 7% cut in emissions, but then I think you were telling me a couple of weeks ago it doesn't really make any difference.
If we look at the emissions, yeah, indeed, on general, we can see that there is a reduction in emissions of about 7%. But the reality is that it's not the today emissions that control climate change. What controls the climate change is everything which we emitted since pre-industrial, and that forms the concentration. And there's a difference between emissions and concentrations. Or we can make different comparisons, or either with the bathtub, how much you put and what is the level, or you can even make a comparison with your bank account. I mean, you have incomes, you have expenses, you have your stuff which is your savings, and what happens is that CO2 just accumulates in the atmosphere. It doesn't go anywhere. Everything which we started emitting in our 1750 by burning coal and other fossil fuels, it just accumulates year by year, because actually what we put is much larger than nature, like the biosphere or the ocean, can take.
So 2020 didn't count for anything really then? It didn't make any difference?
We've seen a small 7% is a relatively small change in emission. But if we look at the concentration continues increasing. So basically, the only thing which we could see is maybe a slight decrease in the growth rate, and we are looking at the data sets, and these slightly less increase in the slightly less decrease in the growth rate. It's like looking for the needle in the stack of the hay, because the natural variability is so large that the 7% decrease in our emissions is not seen in the short data set. So we need to measure another 10 years and do the forward analysis to see if it had an impact or not. Also, don't forget, but also don't forget that we are talking about huge changes in the, let's say, levels of CO2 which are driven by the biosphere.
I'm going to bring up the graph actually that you sent me, Oksana. So you can talk us through that.
So we can look at the graph and we can see that when we had the peak of the, let's say, the first wave and the peak of the lockdowns, there was a substantial reduction in emissions in the power sector, ground transportation, and the aviation and shipping. And that is related to the limitation on our mobility. But even in a peak, when we had the peak reduction, you can see we go down 17%. But if you think about it, it felt like the life stood still. Nothing is moving, nobody is doing anything, we are all staying at home.
It did feel like that.
It felt like we are dead. But in reality, feeling dead means we are still emitting 87% of, or 83% of what we emit at the maximum. And that is because we didn't change our consumption patterns. And if you continue looking at the plot, you can see that majority of the sectors like energy consumption and the industrial emissions, they picked up later on, and they even exceed the levels of 2019.
Nathan, what's your feeling? Do you think we're going to go back to kind of business as usual, actually, now in 2021 and in the years going forward?
I think it's really interesting because you just said we haven't changed our consumer behaviors, but I think we haven't also changed the way we're doing politics. It's exactly like, you know, someone was diabetic and say, oh, we need to quit sugar. But maybe, you know, not entirely. Maybe I'm going to reduce the number of sugar I eat each day by 55%, right? That was the target that they fixed in 2020. But not now, but in 9 years' time. And you know, I'm speaking about a 50% reduction compared to when I was a chain eater back in the 2000s, and I'll make a big family dinner around that, which I'll call, you know, Climate Ambition Summit. That's what happened just a month ago. So I think that on that side, there is still a lot of, you know, big commitments from the state that come and say, yes, sure, we're gonna, you know, set those targets. Indeed, they are more ambitious than the one they would, you know, set up back in 2018 or 2017. But still, it's very, very hard to understand how this is gonna be achieved. And I think we're getting a bit tired of those summits years after years that, you know, doesn't change really. There's
a lot of promising, right? There's a lot of promising goes on. I was having a little look through at which countries are committing to being climate neutral by 2050, and that means climate neutral, I think, in most cases, which isn't even CO2 neutral, it's methane and things as well. And you now have the US on that list, and you have Canada and Chile and Colombia and South Africa and the EU, and lots of EU countries are on there. Are we in any way on the path to actually achieving that, or is it just something that sounds nice and hopefully gets you a few votes? What do you think, Nathan?
I think the first thing is that, what I said, is very hard to understand how they will achieve it. But I think the second thing is, like, for example, if we take the EU, science and was telling us, and all the reports, that we were, if we were to achieve the Paris Agreement, we needed 65% reduction target, and they only decided on a 55%. At first, the ambition is not enough. But secondly, I think what's really important is that what we've seen in 2020 is that all the states and many of them in Europe, for example, have decided to get, you know, green recovery packages. And when you look at that, you only see 25%, 30% that will go to the green economy. And this is a big worry, because if you invest so much money for green jobs, for, you know, going toward a green economy, toward more renewables, but at the same time, you don't have, you know, conditionality for all the other policies you're gonna do. And if all the other part of the money is gonna contradict the money that has been invested in the first 30%, how can you ensure that we're gonna really achieve the fair and green transition the youth climate movement has been asking for now the past 3 years?
Jane, how do you feel talking to these and hearing these youth climate movement people? I mean, what because you've been involved in this since, let's say, before it was trendy, because you know what I mean? How do you feel?
Well, what I feel is, you know, that I'm very glad that young people are now more educated, they learn more, and they're becoming aware of the problems. Of course, they don't have the experience to understand that you can't just say, stop doing that, because it doesn't work that way. You can't suddenly stop all emissions, because we've got to find ways to carry on without putting out all those emissions into the atmosphere. So I'm really delighted. I've got my own youth movement, Roots and Shoots, in 86 countries of all ages. And they're working to make this a better world with projects to help people, animals, and environment. Because one thing I've learned in the rainforest is that everything is interconnected. And so often you solve one problem, yeah, I've done it. But in solving that problem, you've created another. And that's a big problem that we face today. So what I've really been working on is the sort of temporary way that we can try and slow down climate change, maybe, and the climate experts can tell me if I'm right or wrong. But the two great lungs of the world are the forests and the oceans, and both of them absorb CO2 from the atmosphere and give us oxygen. And we've lost half of our rainforests. So I've been concentrating on trying to protect and restore rainforests and plant trees, and also try and stop people eating too much meat, moving towards a plant-based diet, which helps reduce the methane emissions, as well as all the fossil fuel that's used in the industrial agriculture.
Was there a moment for you personally when you were younger, when you became aware of climate change as a concept? Was there a kind of an example or a moment that you can give us? Was it something you just became aware of over a long period of time?
It was gradual over a long period of time, because remember that when all this began, I was still kind of shut away in the forests of Gombe, and an awful lot of international news wasn't reaching me. And it wasn't until the Paris Agreement, actually, that I was drawn out of my comfort zone into some of these large gatherings, which I really don't like being part of, but seem to do it more and more. And then I began to understand about climate change, to try and learn what I could about it from a layman's point of view.
That's interesting, isn't it? That you were kind of, I think we all sort of had our moments of kind of going through that process, but also it's actually relatively recent, I think, for a lot of people, isn't it? And this is, I know, that's why we think that maybe in 2020, there were a lot of younger people, there was a moment of kind of awakening and going, you know, our interconnectedness, as you were talking about with nature. I'm just going to...
The other thing is that I had an advantage of traveling around the world. I've stood in Greenland with Inuit elders and seen ice pouring out of that great ice cliff, and them saying when we were young, it didn't even melt in summer, and this was late winter. And I've seen people had to be moved from their island homes because they were no longer livable at high tide, or at least in a storm, because of water levels, sea levels rising, ice melting. I've seen the results of the terrible flooding and droughts because of weather pattern changes. It's the weather pattern changes. Everywhere I go, or used to go till I was locked down, people would say, but it wasn't like this. You should be raining now, or it should be dry now. Everywhere, all around the world, people were saying that to me.
Carlo, that's something that I guess is echoed in the science, right? There are figures we can put on that.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and I think this year is quite telling in terms of weather pattern changing. So if you see what has happened, you mentioned it yourself, Jeremy, in your introduction, what has happened during the summer in Siberia, that's extraordinary. Now, we don't want to associate extreme events one-to-one with climate change. It's complex. There are a lot of variability, there are a lot of elements we need to take into account. But 38 degrees in the northern latitude of Siberia on the edge of the Arctic is certainly a very extreme, a very rare event, and I don't think has occurred in recent memory. And another event that you may recall is what has happened on Mont Blanc this summer, where a small lake appeared just on top of the mountain at a level that you normally don't see water. And while preparing for this interview, I was looking on some of the data set that we put together and we make available to everyone for free as part of the program. And there is a lot of data available on glaciers, and European glacier in particular. And I was, I mean, at times it happens. You don't tell the figure in your mind. You look around, and I was absolutely surprised to just have an idea of how big is the ice melt for glaciers in Europe. We're talking about hundreds of kilometer cube of water that is no longer there. So in terms of what this means for local climate, for patterns of variability, for biodiversity, for all sorts of phenomena we are used to, that's an incredible change. So if I were to pick just a couple of examples in Europe, which is close to where I live, is a place I know best. Well, these changes in the mountain region and the changes in the Arctic. So the loss of sea ice, for instance, that again this year has been quite extraordinary. From July to October, we have seen the lowest ever sea ice extent for that period of the year. That's very very significant and changes significantly the local climate, especially as we've seen in northern Siberia.
Yeah. And we had one of our reporters there on the ground in August, and it was extraordinary to see the guys talking about what was happening there. And I recommend having a look at that on the Euronews.com website. A question from Diana Patricia, who's asking, scientific knowledge has a relevant role in guiding the transition for a cleaner, sustainable world. How can it become more influential in environmental law? I'm wondering, I don't know anything about how environmental laws are drafted, but are they coming to scientists, the lawmakers, and getting your data and kind of integrating those things into what they're doing in terms of policy?
Yeah, well, in many respects, I think we are seeing an unprecedented interest for data in general in legislation, and climate data is one of these essential data that is becoming a key ingredient for legislation. I think in order for this to happen, there are a number of other things that needs to happen. One of which is that we need to ensure that the data the legislation is based upon is good quality data, is data that is curated, is not data that comes from an unknown source and or found on a scrap piece of paper. And these require a complete rethinking of how do we guarantee the quality of that data. That goes from the gathering of the observation to the curation of the data, to the curation of the metadata, for instance, to the data rescue, to recovering data that is lost or is existing in paper format. So there is a lot of that is required if we want the climate information to get into the legislation. And we are seeing that interest, for instance, in standardization or in new financial disclosure that are becoming now the norm, that they require really good quality data in order to function.
It's really interesting what you're saying there, kind of a change then in the way the politicians are behaving. I'm going to come in with some of the more political questions, and I expect Nathan will have something to say about some of these. Somebody called N. Bloomberg is asking, how can we change the way that super rich business owners are thinking? Are they, I suppose what they're making reference to is that people trying to make profit on things which aren't sustainable. And maybe they should be thinking about how to make profit on things that are sustainable. What do you think, Nathan?
Well, thanks. First, thank you, Carlo, for reminding everyone and here on this European outlet that climate change is already happening here, and you can see the effects, and you can see as well with climate migration. You can see it in the Alps, you can see it in our mountains, and that's always good to remind our politicians in Brussels or in the capitals that it's already happening, and you don't need to go in the global south or in other countries to see it as well. I think it's a very important question. I think first, there is, of course, the importance of government making sure that the businesses are held accountable, and this goes, of course, very, very quickly with the kind of fossil fuel related businesses. For example, it's always so striking to see that there's the COP26 happening at the end of the year, and this is the big climate event where all the leaders are going to get together and decide. And this one is very important. It's 5 years after Paris. It has been postponed for 1 year.
Yep.
And the UK government is asking a big consulting firm called the Boston Consulting Group to help design the event, and this consulting firm is advising 19 out of the 25 25 biggest fossil fuel firms in the world. So I think first, the governments can do much in terms of putting pressure on businesses and making sure as well that they don't work together with them when it comes to deciding on our future, especially when it comes to climate change. But it's not just about climate change. So as Jane Goodall reminded, a crisis, and I would add as well the social crisis, because the inequalities are extremely important and they are rising. There's more and more rich and there's more and more poor people as well.
How do you connect with the richer people and to get them to change their mindset and to reorientate the way that they're doing business, do you think?
Well, there was a very, very interesting article in The Guardian a few months ago that was saying that 1% of the richest people cause 50% of global emission when it comes to flying. And we talk a lot about flying, right? Because it's one of the biggest impacts you can have when you try to reduce your personal consumption. And we always say to people to reduce their consumption. But then, this shows that the richest are the one having the biggest impact when it comes to emissions. So I think that, reducing inequalities in terms of taxing those that are having all the resources is one of the things which is the most important. For example, we're not talking anymore about this tax, for example, taxing all the financial, transaction for 1%, 2%. It could help us just, finance the debt of all the poorest countries, but also maybe finance the green and fair transition we need and have this kind of incremental change that Jane Goodall was speaking just before.
It's interesting to talk about developing world and developed world as well, and some of the questions that we've had are related to that. I'll just highlight two of them, and I think they're kind of touching on similar topics. New York Kiri is asking whether developing countries are going to kind of skip the fossil fuel era that we've lived through, at least us as Europeans. And then somebody else called NS Rahela asking whether countries in every part of the world, be they developed or developing, have actually got the same concept of climate change. Do they see the same urgency? Have they got the same attitudes? I don't know much about that question. Maybe, Jane, you might have something to say about that. And we'll check, because I think your microphone is off. Here we go.
No, it's not.
No, you're all good. Yep.
Yep. Well, first of all, I think alleviating poverty is something we have to do because it's very important. Because if we're coming back to my pet thing of saving forests, which also saves biodiversity, which saves the healthy ecosystems that we all depend on. And if you're really poor and you're in a rural area, you're going to cut down the last trees, not because you're stupid, not because you don't realize it's going to cause terrible erosion, but because your population is growing and you have overused your farmland. It's become infertile. So in your desperation to feed your family, you cut down the trees to grow more food or to make some charcoal. And so it's all these things becoming interrelated. But I want to add one thing to what's been said, and that's about how do we change these big businesses. And it's what's beginning to happen. It's very interesting. Consumer pressure, as people become more aware and understand better about, for example, the effect of using palm oil on the forests and this kind of thing. People are beginning to stop buying products that are made in an unethical way. And that has caused some change in some of the big companies. And if governments would just subsidize clean alternative energy, with all the problems I know that produces, but still it's better than coal. But governments instead have this cozy relationship with the oil and gas companies, and that's what they subsidize, and that's the companies they give tax breaks to.
I want to talk to Oksana. Thank you for that, Jane. I think that's really interesting. But what's always in the back of my mind is how much of a difference are some of these things going to make really to the climate longer term? And I know that there's a kind of a slow reaction of the climate. I mean, we talked about people trying to be carbon neutral by 2050. Does that make any sense? And would you see any difference by 2050 if you did that, or would you need to wait till the next century to see a difference? Oksana, I think that your microphone might be cut. There we go.
I think that the climate system has some delay in the response. So if we cut or if we stop CO2 emissions right now due to the long lifetime of CO2 in the atmosphere, then we will see those concentrations, which are already there, going down very, very slowly. So it won't be like an immediate, if we switch all emissions right now, it won't be an immediate response in the temperature. So there is a delay between the actions which we take on the CO2 or on the other greenhouse gases. Maybe the methane is probably the most promising one because it's a short-lived, so you can actually get response in the climate system quite fast. But with CO2, we need to look at the much longer time horizon. And even if we stop everything now, like if we put 0 CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, even in 1,000 years, we will still be like 30% of the difference between the pre-industrial level and the peak level, even in 1,000 years. That's why it's so important to take all the actions both on CO2 and all the other gases. But it doesn't mean that we should wait, because each year counts. Each year we add more CO2 emissions and more CO2 emissions, and that all accumulates. So the earlier we act, the better it is.
It's always sobering talking to you. I feel that I have these moments of optimism, and then I talk to Oksana, and then I think, oh, that's a reality check. What do you think, Nathan? Was that a reality check? Microphone. Ah, he's disappeared. He's frozen. My goodness. Now he seems to have disappeared entirely. He's still there.
I'm back. Yeah. If you're referring to me, I'm back.
You're back. Go on.
What were you asking? Sorry, because it cut.
No, I was just wondering whether that was a bit of a reality check, listening to Oksana and what she has to say.
No, it is definitely, and from Carlo as well. And I think what's very important as well is what led us to start this movement. And of course, some of our critiques might say that with the pandemic and everything online, we can't keep pressure on our policymakers. But I think, as Jen, you said, we're still holding businesses, governments accountable, and we're doing it online. But I think what's very important, and that hasn't been said here as well, is that we also need system change. And I think one of the biggest asks from us was to say we need system change, and we need to look at the crisis from a kind of intersectional aspect, thinking the crisis as a whole and not just about climate change, not just about biodiversity crisis, etc. And in that sense, to answer to the questions you were asking on development, I think it's extremely important to remember that the way we frame the climate crisis in the North is completely different in other countries, and especially in some countries in what we call the global South, and that's already very problematic. And for example, when we talk about the UNFCCC, which is the Convention on Climate Change, there is always this kind of dynamic where the wealthy countries in the global North are teaching the global South how to do things, when we all know that the challenges they're facing are often due to the kind of colonial relationship they're being maintained in, for example, Western Africa, if we want to name a few. So I think this is really, really important, because one of the biggest problem we need to tackle is to make our policymakers and the policymakers and the leaders to understand that if this doesn't change, we cannot bring just like small changes and small targets, etc. We need to rethink also the way we do development aid, for example, development subsidies, etc.
Do you think, Dan, you were just talking about differences in perspective, that there's awareness in rapidly developing countries in other parts of the world in the South? And as somebody said, are they going to kind of, that question, are they going to kind of skip the fossil fuel era? Do you see that happening, or is in fact the path going to be similar to the one that happened over the course of my lifetime?
Well, first, the most developed countries need to get their things together and reduce their fossil fuel emissions first, before teaching other countries that trying to get a standard of living which might be acceptable. But I think what's very important as well is how we, kind of, and Jan Goodall was already talking about, protecting biodiversity. And I think it's very important to talk about that, because in September, there was this target that has been set to protect and, to protect biodiversity. And the idea was to do 30% of biodiversity protected area by 2030. And those kind of, relationship where the global north countries or developed countries are saying we need to protect, well, it's very problematic for people on the ground. It's very problematic for local peoples, and especially indigenous communities. And probably one part of the solution is to change the way we approach the designing of the solutions we're trying to bring. And changing this designing is including youth, because of course we should have a say in those processes, and we don't have a say, a very, very little one. And the green recovery packaging designing has shown us that we weren't included at all in the discussion, but also including people that are at the front line of the climate crisis. And by doing so, we could try to find new solutions and better solutions to tackle the climate crisis.
I want to go to some more of the questions that we've been having, and thanks very much for sending those in. Kalyan Jana is talking about what long-term plans or projects there may be in the EU for planting trees, basically doing so in order to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. I don't know whether anybody here on the panel has any specifics to say about tree planting projects in the EU, but in general, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere by doing so, how relevant and useful is that? Do we need to do that now? Oksana, maybe you can talk about that a little bit, because it's something that we hear about, but is it actually a useful thing to do?
Well, growing forest is always a useful thing to do, and preserving forest is also a very, very good thing to do. We've seen that in multiple countries, the national determined contributions, the things which they want to do for climate, are based on the massive reforestation. They wanted to increase the forest cover, but there are also some tricks for the forest, in a sense that the current accounting system is that you count the plants and then multiply them with something and say that this is the uptake. It may not work in the future because the climate is changing, and plants are not just the pumps. That's not the mechanical pumps. These are living creatures. And they are also sensitive to availability of water, the temperatures, and availability of nutrients. And what we've seen, for example, with our colleagues who are making measurements in Amazon basin, they said that there was a massive deforestation in Amazon basin. And what happened is that the local weather pattern has changed. And it changed to the way that there is less precipitation over the remaining forest. So the remaining forest is not taking up CO2 either. It breathes, so it is a source of CO2 rather than a sink. So when we try to do the reforestation projects, we need to be very careful, because the forests will be competing with us for fresh water. They will be competing with us for the land where you can grow the food for humans. And you can't grow the monoculture, because monoculture is not very good for biodiversity either. So you need to actually recover the good indigenous forest, which is rich in biodiversity and which is working as a whole ecosystem. And with the monoforest, I mean, we've seen some countries who are planting the palm plantation, saying, okay, this is a plant, right? So supposedly it should be taking CO2. But in reality, this is not the most efficient plant to actually take CO2. And also it emits something like it emits some volatile organic compounds, which create a local air quality problem all of a sudden where there is no air quality problem. So it is a living creature, and we need to be respectful. We need to respect what we have and be very mindful that growing forest with their limited water availability and nutrients availability may create something which will breathe just like us and create another source of CO2.
Jane, listening to Oksana there, do you somewhat despair actually that we actually don't know what we're doing? We think we might have the answers, but we're just not really very good at this whole planet managing thing.
Well, I think actually we're making very big strides. So what got me into all of this was flying over the Little Gombe National Park, where I did all my research. When I began, it was part of the equatorial forest belt that stretched right across equatorial Africa. By mid-80s, it was a tiny island of forest, and all around were bare hills. More people living there than the land could support, struggling, living in poverty. And that's when it hit me. If we don't help these people find alternative ways of living without destroying the forest, then we can't even try and save the chimps. So this program that we began in 1990, Takari, is now in all 104 villages throughout Chimp Range. Fly over, you will not see bare hills. The forests have come back, not exactly as they were, but they're all indigenous trees. And that program is now in 6 other African countries, added to which, I said Roots and Shoots is in 86 countries. We've been planting trees for a long time. They're always indigenous and they're always looked after. And the other thing is going back to the ocean, you know, this other great lung of the world. And there, the kelp forests, the seagrass, they also absorb huge amounts of CO2. But because we've so polluted it and it's become acidic, it can't do its job properly anymore. So working on cleaning up the ocean, which means stopping all the rubbish going down the rivers, that people have begun to understand. And once people understand, we're getting more and more people involved in doing these things, you know, while people work on all these technologies to withdraw CO2, etc., and make clean green energy. We want to work with the systems that also help to protect biodiversity, because we need to do it all. I mean, I keep coming back to that. We need to do all of it.
Yeah. I'm going to go to some of the questions we have, which are going in a completely different direction to the way that our conversation is going at the moment. And I think Carlo might be able to answer some of these. One from Eximpo Trade: why is solar forcing not considered on climate models by many publications? Is that the case? And if so, is it not taken into account?
No, it's not the case, and it's not the case in climate model, and it's not the case in any of the plot we have shown today or we discussed today, which are based basically essentially in observation. So there is this is accounted directly because it's a reconstruction of observation, and even in climate model, the periodicity of the variation in the solar output are factored in quite accurately. So I don't think it's an accurate statement.
There you go. Okay, so they are taken into account and they are in the publications. They might not just be reported by the journalists like me, but they're there. Okay, another one in similar direction, and I think you also this might have an answer for this one from Julia Carr. Why do experts only blame emissions for global warming? There's evidence that the planet is heating up because of the magnetic layer of the planet being eroded, lessening the protection from the sun. Is that in any way true?
Not in any significant level. Nothing. I mean, actually, what I found it fascinating of this debate about climate change is the fact that you know, we usually say it's not rocket science and so on. Well, actually, this science is very old. It's really not new. The fundamental principle behind greenhouse gases was discovered in the late 19th century. And the estimate of the climate sensitivity, so how much the planet will warm as an effect of fossil fuel, actually was pretty much captured by Arrhenius at the end of the 19th century. So, you know, since then we have improved. We understood many more processes. We now have much more sophisticated mechanism to detect and to predict what's gonna happen. But strangely enough,
do you get a little bit frustrated though, people who are asking these questions, who seem to be suggesting that there's some kind of secret angle that actually explains everything that the scientists or the journalists like me are not reporting on? How does that make you feel?
Well, I think it's the flavor of the month, right? This sort of global conspiracy that there is something behind. And the truth is that I'm not mad at these people at all, because I think as a scientist, our job is to challenge it. It's not to work by dogma. It's to actually say, why? I don't believe it. Show me the evidence, right? That's the motto of the Royal Society. I don't trust you in your word. I want to see the evidence of it. And the beautiful thing of the science is that it's quite solid, and nobody has managed to disprove it. And actually, all the data that that you presented in your show and we make available is there for anyone to check and compare and try to find a different explanation. And we will be delighted if we were wrong and there were a different explanation, but that's not the case.
Yeah, undersea volcanoes and whatever suddenly heating up the globe, it would you could suddenly go, that's the reason, but it turns out it's not the reason. Thinking of which, another one in similar vein, which is from I am Salid 12, who's asked us on Instagram, when the glaciers melt, will the Earth flatten out?
Well, right. In the sense of the Earth as a planet becoming flat, I can reassure your listener that's not going to happen. In the sense of variation in the crust of the planet as an effect of the deglaciation, yes, actually we are seeing it already, and it's one very important element that we need to take into account. For instance, when we try to calculate the change in the local sea level, because on the one hand we know that the sea level is changing and is going up because of the effect of the warming, but on the other hand we have also to check, especially in some regions that have been characterized by heavy coverage of ice in the historical period, that the land is going up itself because is responding to the lack of weight of the ice that used to be there. So in that sense,
post-glacial rebound. So there is
indeed
a change, kind of flattening out. If that's what the flattening out that you're talking about, then there is.
Well, I wouldn't call it flattening. I would say probably the opposite, but nevertheless, yeah,
smoothing out. But yes, interesting. And I remember looking at some of the maps on sea level rise, and you see that there's something happening at the end of the Baltic Sea, and that's exactly what that's all about. And there's an explanation for these things, as you say. That facts always good. Somebody was just asking about biofuels, because we need to look for alternative energy sources, but we also don't want to spend our time messing around with crops that might be taking up land in which you could be growing food. What is the view on biofuels? Whoever would like to talk about that, because it's a really interesting one. It's got a lot of potential, but it's got some downsides too.
I may answer this question to a certain extent. Though biofuels looked as a promising fuel to go from fossil fuels, or on the other hand, the plantations where you actually grow the fossil fuel emit quite a lot of those volatile organic compounds, which I mentioned, and they created a problem for air quality. So that again brings me to the point which Jane made, that we need to look at the whole problems holistically, and there are some win-win solutions, but there are some win-lose solution. Like in the case of biofuel, it's good for climate, but it's very bad for air quality. And there are some solutions which go, like for example, with controlling aerosol and reducing air pollution, that's good. So if we reduce air pollution and we reduce the aerosols, we save some life of people. Yeah, but aerosols give us kind of a offset or the negative radiative forcing, so we make the planet warmer if we clean the air. So we need to look at the problem holistically and not just look at one thing and then, as Jane said, then there's something else pops out and then we need to fix it, and then there's a chain reaction.
Nathan, I'm interested in your conversations you have at pretty top level, UN Secretary General. Are those people, as far as you're aware, taking on board this kind of information, the subtlety of the kinds of some of the answers that we've had in some of these questions?
I think when it comes to the UN and Antonio Guterres, I think he's not so far from being a very good advocate for more climate action. I think what's very missing, and that's what we're gonna bring in our next meeting with him later on this month, is the kind of thinking, as you were just saying, holistically the crisis, and not just looking at, you know, pushing for climate finance, pushing for more climate adaptation solutions, but looking at as well how we can, you know, bring back the people in the conversation. And when we say the people, not just, you know, the privileged white people living in the Western world, but looking at, for example, and we were talking about nature and the importance of bringing nature. Yes, it's great to have great targets on nature, but you need to do it as well with the people on the ground. You need to think, and it's on a case-by-case basis. You cannot just say, we're going to achieve this target if you're not building it with the people on the ground. And I think for us, this is the most important. It comes with involving young people. It comes with involving marginalized communities. It comes also with involving indigenous communities and doing better for that, bringing them in the conversation. And so this will be, among many other things, the few thoughts we'll bring to world leaders for 2021, but also to Antonio Guterres.
Jane, I see you nodding to some of that.
Working with the people on the ground is so important, and no conservation effort conserving wildlife is really going to work unless the people on the ground who live there, in whose hands the future probably lies, unless they're in an autocratic regime, we need them on our side. So these people I mentioned around Gombe and now spreading around the world, they have become our partners in conservation because they now understand that protecting the forest, protecting the environment is for their own future as well as for wildlife. And we've given them the tools with which they can monitor their environment. They know how to use smartphones. They know how to upload their data into a platform in the clouds, even if they can't read. And they all got together and had a big meeting, decided what they would record when they went out to monitor the health of their forest. They're very proud. And as I say, they've become our partners in conservation.
That's a fantastic story. Thank you for that. And it's been great talking to everybody. I'm going to wrap things up soon, but I'm just going to go back to really the beginning theme of this discussion. And in fact, one of the questions we've just had from somebody called Ros Rebel, who's saying, well, related to the coronavirus pandemic, the lockdowns, etc., and the state of the climate, surely logic dictates that COVID has positively altered climate change. We had less air traffic, less road traffic. Those two factors alone had to have had an effect. Who wants to answer that one? Oksana, I can imagine you could answer that one. Carlo also.
Yes, sir. When we had a less traffic and less air flights, we did have a decrease in emissions. And I mean, we can go to my plot number 3 once again and put it on the screen so that you can actually realize how small is this effect. I mean,
we'll bring it up right now.
So if we look at this plot, then in the middle of pandemic, when there was no traffic, there was quite good improvement of air quality because you can see it immediately. It's short-lived gases like NOx or some other gases. You can see immediately improvement in air quality as soon as you resume traveling. As soon as you resume using your cars, you get the same air quality as you had before. Or concerning the aviation and shipping, you can see that aviation is actually just a small % of our emissions. All the people think that actually aviation is the big emitter, but if we look in perspective of how much we emit, that's actually one of the smallest contribution. It's energy production. That's where we have the largest proportion of emissions, and we didn't change it. Maybe Carlo can end.
Well, no, I completely agree. I don't think I can articulate it better than you have already, Oksana. For me, the real lesson learned from this pandemic actually is not so much the impact he had directly on the climate. And this probably is not the director of the Climate Change Service talking here. It's probably me as an individual. But I felt, looking around me, that many people reconnected to the environment to a level that didn't happen in the last probably few decades. So this lack of pollution, this lack of smog, this lack of traffic actually changed their attitude towards the environment around us. And for me, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on the way you want to look at it, this is likely to be the most significant impact on the climate that this pandemic had.
Nathan, any kind of concluding words from you on that topic, really, of the coronavirus pandemic and climate?
Well, I think it has really shown that even though we had and we have a tremendous opportunity to, put the money where it needs to be to really bring forward the green transition we need, there is still a lot of selfishness. And you can see it with the vaccines, right? It is a thing where all the developed countries are trying to get it for them, right? Rather than, that if other countries have it, it will come back then. So we need to look at that also holistically. And I think that what's really, really needed is the need of mindset change that we talked about before, but also to stop with selfishness and to bring back kindness and goodness in the way we interact, in the way we work in our economy, and also the way we build the society we want in 2050 when I'll be lot 50.
I'm not expecting to make it to 2050, but Jane, what's your feeling based on what has happened in these last 12 months or so, and this discussion we've just had? Are you an optimistic person these days? You spend your day talking to people like this virtually. Are you full of hope?
Do I have hope? Yeah, my reasons for hope are, well, first of all, if we don't have hope, if people all lose hope, that's the end of us. Because if you don't have hope, why bother? Why do what you do if you don't think it's going to make a difference? And so we need hope. And I've always been sort of optimistic, an optimistic realist. I totally understand everything that's bad, but hope, think about it. I go to the young people. Once they understand, once they are empowered to act and we listen to their voices, and perhaps help them to have a relationship with the elders who have hopefully some wisdom, then these young people I'm thinking of, they're changing the world now. And what I particularly love, there's many, many youth programs. What I love about our Roots and Shoots is that it's so holistic. It's like nature. It's helping the young people understand that you can't just take one little piece of a puzzle. You have to see how that little piece fits in the whole before you can see the whole picture. And fortunately, one advantage of the huge numbers of us that exist on this planet, which is a huge problem, by the way, but there are enough people to tackle all these different problems so that somebody is passionate about changing our agricultural systems. Somebody is passionate about reducing our unsustainable lifestyle. Somebody's passionate about picking up litter. And so we're changing the world with these young people everywhere. And then the resilience of nature. Places that we utterly destroyed can be given another chance. Animals on the brink of extinction have been given another chance. And our intellect is what distinguishes more than anything else from the other animals. They're way more intelligent than we thought. But think we designed a rocket that goes up to Mars and can take photographs of the red planet, so we know we don't want to go and live there. And it's absurd that this most intellectual creature is destroying its only home. So we need to get these intellects together to give hope to the young people that if we get together and we look at the picture as a whole, and we all do our bit and realize every single day we live, we make some impact on the planet. If we do that, we can indeed make change and stop the Armageddon.
Thank you, Jane. Very wise words. And I will end it there. Jane Goodall, Carlo Buontempo, Nathan Metenier and Oksana Tarasova, thank you very much for being with us here on Euronews YouTube channel and If you want to know more about climate change and get the facts, please go to euronews.com/climate now, where you can see all the data from the Copernicus Climate Change Service, see the different reports from different parts of the world about what's really happening to our planet now. Thanks for watching.